Jack Calloway stood on the porch, staring at the sun dipping low behind the hills. His hands gripped the railing, rough and calloused, worn from years of holding on to something he could never quite let go of. The silence stretched across the land, broken only by the wind cutting through the grass. A creak of the door behind him, his brother Gus stepped out, his boots scraping the wood. "Who are you waiting for?" Gus's voice was rough, like it hadn't seen a kind word in years. Jack didn't answer. He was waiting, but not for anyone he could put a name to. Then, the footsteps. Slow at first, then a hard knock against the ground. "Jack." The voice, a woman's voice, cracked the air like a whip. Jack didn't move, but his stomach churned. Maggie. He hadn't seen her in years, not since that day, the one that haunted him in the quiet moments between labor and sleep. The day he left her standing at the altar, abandoned, his escape, his cowardice. But she had come back, and standing in the doorway of his life, she was still the woman he'd never been strong enough to hold on to. She was thinner than he remembered, the shadows under her eyes deeper. The lines of grief were carved into her face, and yet she stood there like a ghost from his past, her hand resting on the old leather suitcase she carried. "You—" Maggie's words cut off, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack couldn't bring himself to say her name, let alone apologize. Gus shifted, uncomfortable. "Jack, are you going to stand there all day or let her in?" Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't look at Gus. "I didn't want to." "I was just about to," Jack said, his voice hollow, without the force it used to have. Maggie stepped forward, the distance between them closing with each step. Her eyes met his, and the silence wrapped around them like the weight of the past. No words came from her lips. Not yet. She didn't have to say a thing. Her presence in the doorway felt like it was about to collapse the ground beneath them. His chest tightened like a fist pulling the air from his lungs. He should have apologized, should have done something, anything. But he hadn't. "I didn't know where else to go," Maggie said, her voice small, like she didn't believe the words herself. Jack's eyes drifted over her, the old familiar pain welling up again. She had always been strong, stronger than he ever gave her credit for. Now she stood before him a widow, no longer the young woman he had known, but still the same. She had no place to go, and he had built his life on old lies, lies he couldn't undo. "Come in, Maggie," he muttered, stepping aside, allowing her to enter the house he once thought would never change. She didn't say anything at first. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway, soft but heavy, like the memories that filled the space. Jack followed her, his feet dragging. Gus stayed behind, hands stuffed in his pockets. Maggie stopped near the fireplace, her fingers grazing the mantel like she was trying to find something familiar in the dust. It felt strange, seeing her here, in the place where so much had gone wrong. Jack cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "You still married?" Her head snapped to him, her gaze sharp, fierce. "I was," she said flatly. The past hung between them like a thread, thin but strong enough to tether them both. She didn't need to elaborate. Jack already knew the answer. You look different," he said, the words stumbling out awkwardly. Maggie chuckled bitterly, her laugh short and dry. "Do I?" Her eyes hardened as if the question itself was an insult. "I meant time. It changes things." She didn't respond to that. The silence was back, thick and suffocating. Gus walked in from behind them, breaking the tension that had stretched too long. "You want supper? You ain't gonna stand there all day." Jack looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "Get lost, Gus." Gus raised his hands in mock surrender and walked back out of the room. Maggie's gaze didn't leave Jack. She was waiting for something, maybe for him to say more, maybe for him to explain why he had left her like he did, why he hadn't come back after all these years. "You know, I thought I might never come back," she finally said, her voice steady but filled with too many years of pain. "But here I am." Jack couldn't speak. She was right. She had come back. And now he was stuck with her presence in his life again. It wasn't just her. It was everything they'd left behind. The things they hadn't talked about. The reasons he hadn't come back. Her suitcase sat near the door. She hadn't even unpacked. She hadn't asked for anything, but she wasn't leaving either. "I can't stay," she continued, her voice quieter now. "But I don't have anywhere else to go." Jack stood there, his heart pounding. He should say something. He should try. But his mouth was dry. Words tangled in his throat. She had nothing left, and he had everything built on her absence. He wasn't a good man, never had been. He had built his life on an empty promise, a lie he told himself for too long. "Maggie, I'm not asking for forgiveness," she interrupted, her voice even. "I'm not even asking for your pity." Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "I just need somewhere to be." Jack could only nod. It was all he could do. He wasn't sure if he could even offer her anything more than that. But at that moment, the past didn't feel so distant. It was right there, in the room with them, heavy and undeniable. And in the silence, Jack realized that the door that never opened had finally creaked open again. Maggie's suitcase thudded against the floor, the soft creak of the old wood breaking the silence between them. She set it down carefully, as if it might fall apart if she didn't. The house smelled of dust, old leather, and sweat, the kind of smell you forget until it's all around you again. Jack watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed. The shadows of the afternoon stretched long across the floor, the light harsh through the window, like the day was angry about something it couldn't say. "Got yourself settled then?" Jack asked, his voice a little too sharp, too brittle. Maggie didn't look at him as she straightened the suitcase, as though making sure it sat exactly where it needed to. "I didn't come here to make you feel better, Jack," she said quietly, but with a certain hardness in her tone. "I didn't come here to be looked after." Jack's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the frame a little too hard. The words stung, but he didn't show it. He never showed it. She was right, though. He hadn't expected her to be the same woman. He'd thought she'd be different, softer maybe broken. But she wasn't. She wasn't broken at all. Instead of responding, he let the silence hang there. The room felt small suddenly, even though it was wide and open. The weight of the years that had passed between them pressed against the walls, curling around them like smoke. "I'm not asking for anything, Jack," Maggie said, turning to face him at last. "I just need a place to stay. You said I could." The words hung between them, brittle as the heat of the day. The old ranch house, the one Jack had spent his whole life in, didn't feel like home anymore. Not with her here. Not with the past standing in the doorway, demanding to be acknowledged. Jack didn't move. He couldn't. Maggie glanced around, taking in the rooms she used to know. The same old photographs lined the walls, yellowed with time, their edges curling like the memories they held. The floorboards creaked under her boots as she moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have. "Have you ever thought about her?" Maggie asked suddenly, her voice like a razor cutting through the quiet. Jack stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Who?" "Maggie Davenport," she said, her lips curling slightly in mockery. "The girl you left behind. Have you ever thought about her?" Jack began, but the words caught in his throat. His mouth was dry. She was still the same woman who had called him out all those years ago, but now she didn't need to. She had become something else. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Stronger, maybe. Still angry but sharper, more focused. "I know you do," she continued, her voice softer now. "I know you still think about the girl you left behind." She paused, taking a breath as if the air had suddenly gotten too thick. "But I'm not her anymore." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. She was right. Maggie had never been the same after he walked away. "And I don't need your pity, Jack," Maggie said, her voice cold, distant. "I don't need you to feel sorry for me. I'm not the woman who needed you to protect her. That woman died a long time ago." Jack clenched his fists at his sides, but still, he didn't say anything. He couldn't find the right words. The weight of the years between them was heavy. Too heavy. He wanted to reach out to her, but he didn't know how. He wanted to say he was sorry, but he wasn't sure it would make a difference anymore. Maggie moved across the room again, her hands brushing the furniture, touching things that had been left untouched for years. She paused in front of the fireplace, where the ashes of the last fire still lingered, cold and gray. She ran her fingers along the edge, dusting off the remnants of something long forgotten. "You know," she said, her voice low, "I don't think you ever really saw me. Not the way I needed you to." Jack felt that like a punch to the gut, though he tried to hide it. He shifted, uncomfortable, but still he didn't say a word. His eyes followed her, but his mind was miles away, drifting back to a time when things seemed simpler, before everything turned into a mess of guilt and silence, before he left her standing there, waiting for him. "I always wondered why you left," she said, more to herself than to him. "I guess I stopped wondering a long time ago." The words hung in the air, between them thick and sharp. Jack finally spoke, his voice a little rough. "I didn't know what else to do." Maggie looked at him then, her eyes hard, searching his face for something that wasn't there. "You didn't know what else to do?" she repeated, as though tasting the words. "That's your excuse, Jack?" He took a step forward, his feet heavy on the floor. "I didn't have a choice. Not the kind you wanted." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack thought she might say something else, something sharper, but she didn't. Instead, she just turned away, her back to him, the silence between them stretching again, louder than anything either of them could say. The heat from the day still pressed in on them, thick and sticky, like it was suffocating the life out of everything in the room. "I'm not the girl you left behind, Jack," Maggie said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I'm someone else now, and I don't need you. I don't need anyone." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Too many to count, too heavy to say. She was right. She had always been right, but that didn't make it easier. It didn't make the silence between them any easier to carry. He turned away, his hand running through his hair, trying to find the words he couldn't quite grasp. Maggie didn't need him. She never had. She was right. She didn't need him. But somehow, he still needed her. The quiet in the house was oppressive. Maggie had settled into the old, worn chair by the window, her gaze fixed on the dirt road outside, though nothing moved there except the dust in the wind. Jack stood by the counter, his fingers brushing the edge of a chipped mug, but he didn't reach for it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a cup of coffee in the morning. It had never mattered before. Maggie's presence filled the space between them. It was as if she were in every room, her silence speaking louder than anything she could say. Jack hadn't expected things to be easy, but he hadn't expected them to feel this heavy either. The air was thick, and the weight of it pressed down on him. Then the sound of boots on the porch broke the quiet. Jack froze. He didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. His body tensed, a knot forming in his stomach. Gus. The door swung open without a knock, a creak of the hinges echoing in the hallway. Gus stepped in, his boots loud against the old wooden floor, the kind of noise that demanded attention. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Jack, his expression hard as stone. He didn't say hello. He didn't say anything at first. "Look who's back," Gus said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. Jack didn't move, didn't meet his brother's gaze. Gus's presence was always like a shadow, lingering over everything, adding a weight that Jack had never been able to shake off. The bitterness between them was years old, thickened by time and silence. "You got a lot of nerve, Jack," Gus continued, his voice rising. "After all these years, you think you can just, what? Pretend like everything's fine?" Jack's chest tightened. He had always known that Gus would be the one to bring everything crashing down. Gus was never the one to let things go. "Gus, not now," Jack muttered, running a hand over his face. He didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to face the anger he knew was coming. But Gus wasn't listening. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "No, Jack," Gus snapped. "It's too late for that. You don't get to run off and leave a damn mess behind, and then show up like you didn't do anything wrong. You think I don't know what you did? You think we all just forget about the day you left her standing there?" Maggie's head snapped up at the mention of her name. She didn't say anything, but her eyes flashed with something sharp, defiance maybe, or hurt. Jack didn't know which one. "You don't get to talk about it like that, Gus," Maggie said, her voice low but steady, the kind of quiet that made everything around them seem louder. "You don't know anything about it." Gus turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "I know enough. You think you've been forgotten, don't you? But we all know what happened, what Jack did." He sneered, the edges of his mouth curling up in a cruel, knowing grin. "You were just the fool who stayed." Maggie didn't flinch. She stood up, her back straight, her eyes never leaving Gus's. "You don't get to call me a fool," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You don't know a damn thing about me." Gus's face twisted, a flicker of surprise flashing in his eyes before the anger set in again. "Oh, I know plenty. I know how you were supposed to be family, but Jack couldn't even stick around long enough to give you a decent chance. I know what it did to you, to all of us." "Gus, stop," Jack said through clenched teeth. He was tired of it, tired of being caught between his past mistakes and his brother's endless judgment. But Gus wasn't done. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, Maggie, but you're not fooling anyone. You're back in the same place you were before. You're still the girl he left behind, the girl nobody wanted." The words hit Maggie like a slap. For a moment, she was still, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The house seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped toward Gus. She didn't say a word. She just walked, each step measured, steady, as if she were walking through the fire Gus had lit with his words. "Maybe you don't get it, Gus," she said, her voice a little quieter now, but no less sharp. "But I'm not the same woman you think I am. And I'm not the one who's been running from my past." Jack's eyes flicked from Gus to Maggie, the tension rising in his chest. He hadn't seen Maggie like this before. So calm, so sure of herself. She wasn't the girl who had been left behind anymore. She had turned into something else, something more than he could ever have imagined. "I'm not running from anything anymore," Maggie continued, her gaze still locked on Gus. "You want to blame me? Blame Jack. But he's the one who made the choice. Not me. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be left behind." Gus's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "I know enough," Maggie said, her voice cold. "I've been living with it. For years. You haven't. You don't get to lecture me about what I've been through, Gus." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling like dust in the air. Gus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jack could see it then. The crack in Gus's armor, the way his anger was slipping, replaced by something else, something more raw, more vulnerable than Jack had ever seen from his brother. But Gus quickly recovered, his anger returning in full force. He turned away, his shoulders stiff. "You think you've got all the answers now, huh?" Maggie didn't flinch. "I don't have the answers, but I'm done letting you think you can control everything. You're not the only one who's been hurt." Jack watched them both, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing, heavy and uneven. The years of resentment, of anger, of everything unsaid were spilling out now, raw and ugly. Jack wanted to say something, to break the tension, but he knew better. There were no words that could fix what had been broken. Not now. Not after all this time. Maggie stepped back, her eyes never leaving Gus. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. "Not for you, not for Jack. I'm here for me." Gus's eyes flickered, the anger still there, but buried beneath something else. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Maggie let out a breath, the tension leaving her body like a storm finally passing. Jack didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything at all. For the first time, he realized that it wasn't just Gus who had something to prove. The desk was a mess. It had always been that way. Papers, old receipts, bills piled high. A few things that didn't belong, but had ended up there anyway. Jack hadn't looked through it in years. He didn't have to. Everything he needed was in his head. But today, the quiet in the house felt different, thicker somehow, and he couldn't stand it anymore. His fingers moved across the surface, pushing aside the clutter, searching for something he didn't know he was looking for. That's when his hand brushed something small tucked underneath a pile of old invoices. A letter. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, the edges curling slightly, worn by time. The paper was heavier than he expected, not the kind you'd just find lying around. It was something more. He didn't recognize the handwriting. The name on the front hit him like a punch to the gut. Maggie Davenport Calloway. For a moment, Jack didn't move. His heart stopped, then restarted, beating faster. He knew what this was. He knew, but he didn't want to. His fingers trembled as he tore the envelope open, the sound sharp in the stillness of the room. The letter inside was long. The ink faded but still legible. The first line nearly made him drop it. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm already gone." Jack's breath caught in his throat. His eyes scanned the rest of the letter quickly, his mind racing. It was from Maggie's late husband, Nathan. The words blurred as Jack read them, but he forced himself to keep going. The letter spoke of his love for her, of the life they had built together, and the family they dreamed of. It was full of memories he had never known, intimate things, private things. Jack felt like an intruder, as though he was trespassing in a part of Maggie's life that didn't belong to him. But he couldn't stop reading. There was mention of their struggles, Nathan's illness, their constant fight to keep the ranch alive, the silent battles Maggie had fought long before Jack had ever left. There were things in this letter that shook Jack, things that made his stomach twist in ways he hadn't felt in years. "I should have done more," one part read. "I should have protected you better from the things we couldn't control." Jack's mind reeled. He had always known Maggie had suffered, but reading this made him realize just how little he had ever understood. She had lived a life of hard work and hardship without him, without anyone but Nathan, who had died far too young. The letter ended with one final line. "I know you'll find someone who can love you the way you deserve. You've always been stronger than I ever could have been." Jack set the letter down slowly, the words still echoing in his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to push them away, but they wouldn't leave. That gap between who he had been and who he was now seemed wider than ever, impossible to bridge. He had left her, he had abandoned her, and here she was, standing in front of him. A woman who had fought through more than he could ever understand. A woman who had survived on her own while he had hidden from his own demons. Jack stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked to the window, looking out at the dry fields beyond the house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the land, the golden light like a memory, something bright and distant, something that could never be recaptured. His thoughts churned, the past and present colliding in a brutal, painful storm. The letter was a wake-up call. Maggie's pain, her fight for survival, it was all there in Nathan's words. And Jack, he had been part of the problem. He hadn't been there. He hadn't been the one to pick up the pieces. Instead, he had run. The silence in the house seemed to grow louder as Jack stood there, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't just Gus's anger. It wasn't just the years that had passed. It was this, the truth that he had never seen Maggie the way she needed to be seen. He had never understood how much she had carried, how much she had sacrificed. The door creaked open behind him, and he turned, his heart leaping in his chest. Maggie stood in the doorway, her eyes fixed on him, her expression unreadable. "You found it?" she asked, her voice steady, but Jack could hear the edge to it. She knew. She knew what he had found, and it felt like she had been waiting for him to come to terms with it. Jack didn't answer at first. His mind was still spinning. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for something, anything, that might explain how they had gotten to this point. "Maggie," he started, but the words were caught in his throat. She stepped inside, her boots light against the floor. She didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze fell to the desk, to the letter now lying on the surface. "I figured you would," she said, her tone flat. Jack felt the weight of her words, but he didn't know how to respond. He couldn't apologize for what he had done. He had already tried to apologize in every way he knew how, and it had never been enough. "I didn't mean to find it," he said, his voice quiet, raw. "But I did, and it changes things, Maggie." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't say anything for a long moment. When she did speak, it wasn't with anger or bitterness. It was with something else, something deeper, darker. "You didn't know," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But now you do." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He couldn't fix what had been broken. He couldn't change the years that had passed, but he could feel the gap between them widening, and it was suffocating. Maggie stepped closer, her eyes searching for him. "Do you understand now, Jack? Do you see what I've lived through?" Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was tight, the weight of everything he hadn't said before pressing down on him. The silence between them was thick, heavier than it had been before, and in that silence, Jack knew that things had changed. They couldn't go back to what they had been, to the time before everything fell apart. But maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. "Maggie." Jack started again, but this time his voice was firmer. "I left you, and I know I can't change that, but I need you to know I'm not running anymore." She looked at him for a long time, and in her gaze, Jack saw something like hope, though it was faint and fragile. But it was there. For the first time in years, he thought maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make things right. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the field behind the house. The dirt was dry, cracked under the weight of the years. Jack squatted by the old barn, his eyes scanning the ground, the memories of that day rushing back like an old wound reopening. He had told himself he wouldn't return here, not after everything that happened. But there was something about this place, something that had a way of drawing him back when he least expected it. The rusted iron gate creaked in the wind, barely holding on to its hinges, much like the rest of the land. The barn, once a place of life and movement, now stood like a forgotten relic, sagging in on itself. Jack's fingers brushed the dirt again, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure why he was here, but the place felt like it still held a part of him, the part he couldn't quite shake. "Jack?" Maggie's voice broke through the silence, steady and unyielding, like always. He didn't look up at first, didn't move. She wasn't far behind, her footsteps quiet on the dry earth. Maggie always had a way of moving that made the ground feel like it was holding its breath. He heard the sound of her approaching, the soft scrape of her boots on the ground, and then the slight crunch of gravel underfoot. Jack stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands. She was standing a few feet away, watching him with the same steady gaze she always had. She didn't ask what he was looking for, didn't question why he was standing out here. She simply waited, like she always did. "You should have left it," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the wind. Jack turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a softness in her gaze, a calmness that he hadn't expected, but there was also something else there, something like understanding, like she knew what he was looking for. Maggie's eyes fell to the dirt, to the object resting there, half buried beneath the soil. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. His father's badge, buried in the earth where it had fallen all those years ago. The metal was old, worn from the years of neglect, but it still gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The badge was a relic of a time long gone, a symbol of authority, of power. It had been his father's badge, worn proudly for years, until the day it had slipped from his hand during a violent confrontation, a moment Jack could never forget. Jack took a step forward, his fingers brushing the dirt away from the badge. It felt like it was calling to him, the weight of it, more than just the metal. It was the weight of everything his father had left behind, everything Jack had never been able to understand. Maggie remained still, her gaze never leaving Jack's hand as it hovered over the badge. "You never really understood him, did you?" she said softly, the words more like a statement than a question. Jack's jaw clenched. The question cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He didn't answer, not immediately. He couldn't. There were too many things he hadn't understood, too many things that had been buried in the dust, things he had never been ready to face. But Maggie wasn't finished. She stepped forward slowly, her movements deliberate, calm. Her hand reached out, and before Jack could stop her, she knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the badge. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her touch was gentle but firm, as if she understood the weight of it all in a way Jack never could. She held the badge in her hand, examining it for a moment before she finally spoke. "You think that thing means something, Jack? You think it gives you power?" she asked, her voice low but clear. "It's just metal, Jack. Just a piece of who your father was." Jack's chest tightened, a knot forming in his throat. He wanted to argue, to fight back against the words she was saying, but he couldn't. He couldn't because she was right. He had always thought that badge was a symbol of strength, of control. But now, looking at it through her eyes, it seemed like nothing more than a faded memory. Maggie stood up slowly, the badge still in her hand, and Jack followed her with his gaze. She held it out to him, the metal gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. "I don't need this," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "And neither do you." Jack took the badge from her, the weight of it in his hand suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had. He stared at it for a moment, his fingers tracing the outline of the worn insignia, but the power it once held seemed to slip through his grasp. "I never knew what to do with it," he muttered, almost to himself. Maggie's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, Jack saw a glimpse of something like sympathy in them. She reached out again, her hand brushing against his arm in a silent gesture of understanding. "You don't have to carry it, Jack," she said quietly. "You don't have to carry any of it." The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment Jack stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. She was right. He had been carrying his father's mistakes, his father's legacy, for so long that he'd forgotten how to let it go. And now, Maggie, stoic and calm, was showing him the way. He looked at the badge again, the metal glinting in the sunlight, and for the first time he felt the weight of it lifting, if only a little. He didn't need it. He didn't need to carry the burden of his father's mistakes any longer. Maggie turned away then, her eyes flicking briefly to the horizon. "You've spent so many years looking for power in the wrong places," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's time to find something else." Jack didn't answer. He wasn't sure he had the words to. Instead, he followed her gaze, looking out over the land, the same land that had been the source of so much pain, so much loss. The fields stretched out before him, empty and endless. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something shift inside him. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it didn't seem so crushing anymore. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Maggie didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and began to walk back toward the house, the badge still in her hand. Jack hesitated for a moment, the old symbol of power still burning in his palm. But he didn't follow her. Not immediately. Instead, he stood there, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something to click into place. And, for the first time in a long while, he thought maybe it had. The air was dry, the smell of smoke rising with the wind, thick and choking. Jack had been in the fields most of the morning, working through the heat, when he saw it, a cloud of dark smoke curling up from behind the barn. At first, he thought it was just dust, but when the wind shifted, he realized it wasn't dust at all. "Fire," he muttered under his breath. His heart started pounding as he dropped the shovel, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. The wind had been fierce, dry enough to turn even the smallest spark into an inferno. The dry grass, the brittle wood of the barn, the stacks of hay, all of it could go up in seconds. He didn't even have to look for Maggie. She was already running toward him, her face hard, her boots crunching against the dry earth. Her eyes were narrowed, focused. "Get the hoses!" she shouted as she reached him, already moving past him toward the pump. Jack didn't waste time questioning her. They both knew what needed to be done. Without a word, he turned and ran toward the well, grabbing the first bucket he could find. The flames were already licking the sides of the barn, orange and hungry. Maggie was already at the pump, cranking it as fast as she could. Jack reached her just as the first burst of water shot out, spraying across the barn. But it wasn't enough. The fire was spreading too fast. Maggie didn't flinch when the heat hit her. She just kept cranking, her face set in a grim line. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted to the other side, grabbing a second hose and aiming it at the fire, trying to push it back. The wind was on their side for now, but that could change in an instant. They worked like this, side by side, for what felt like hours, water sloshing, flames licking at the sky, and the smell of burning wood filling the air. The heat was suffocating, but Jack couldn't focus on it, not with the fire threatening to swallow everything. Not with Maggie beside him, her hands steady, her movements precise. She was focused, pushing forward, and there was something about her determination that made the world slow down, made everything else fade away. Jack felt a pang deep in his chest. He hadn't seen this side of her in years, not since the days when they worked together, when everything felt simpler. Before he left, before everything had fallen apart. Maggie's resilience stirred something in him, something old and buried deep beneath layers of guilt and regret. He'd never told her, but he admired her, more than he had ever let on, more than he was ready to admit. She was stronger than anyone he had ever known. "Jack," Maggie's voice sliced through the smoke. He looked up to see her waving him over. Her hand was raised, pointing at the other side of the barn, where the fire was spreading faster now. The wind was shifting, and it wasn't on their side anymore. He ran to her without thinking, grabbing another hose and aiming it at the fire. The two of them moved like clockwork, each anticipating the other's next move. They worked together like they had done countless times before. The world around them was burning, but they were in sync, determined to stop it. The fire was relentless, but they were determined too. "You have to get to the back," Maggie shouted over the roar of the flames, her voice strained but clear. "I'll hold this side." Jack didn't hesitate. He could see the flames spreading, climbing higher with every passing second. He knew they couldn't afford to waste time. "I'm not leaving you," he shouted back, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Maggie's eyes met his. The intensity in her gaze, something he couldn't quite place. But before he could argue, she nodded sharply. We both get this fire out, or none of it matters." And just like that, Jack knew. He ran around the back of the barn, the heat following him, the air thick with smoke. Maggie's steady presence in the chaos was the only thing keeping him grounded. The fire was wild, but they weren't done yet, not as long as they had breath in their lungs. He worked fast, spraying the water across the flames that were licking up the sides of the barn. Every second counted now. The fire was starting to crawl its way up the wooden beams, and Jack's mind raced as he fought to keep the flames at bay. "Jack!" Maggie's voice rang out again. She was on the other side of the barn, and her shout carried through the smoke. "It's too late. It's not going to hold." He didn't have to see her face to know the fear in her voice. The fire had grown too strong, but Jack wasn't going to let it win. He pushed harder, pouring all his strength into the hose, aiming the water directly at the flames, trying to force them back. Maggie's voice, strong even through the chaos, gave him something to hold on to, something to keep fighting for. He could hear her fighting beside him, her steady hands on the pump, her face set in a fierce determination. She wasn't going to let this place go down without a fight. And for the first time in years, Jack found himself fighting for it too. It took everything they had. The fire didn't relent, didn't make it easy. But eventually the flames started to die down, flickering and sputtering as the water took hold. The roar of the fire began to fade, replaced by the crackling of the last embers. The air still burned, but the worst of it was over. Jack sank to his knees, gasping for breath, his skin slick with sweat and soot. He didn't know how long they'd been at it, but it felt like a lifetime. Maggie stood over him, her face streaked with ash, but her expression calm, steady. She didn't say anything at first. Neither of them did. They were both too exhausted, too overwhelmed by what they had just survived. The barn still smoldered, but the fire was out. The damage was done, but they had saved what they could. Jack's chest rose and fell as he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "We did it," he muttered, almost to himself. Maggie nodded, her eyes never leaving him. "We did." For a moment, neither of them moved, but in the silence that followed, Jack realized something. They had made it through the fire together, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like they were so far apart anymore. The fire may have been out, but the flames between them still burned. They both knew it. Neither of them was ready to face the truth yet, but it was there, and it was waiting. The fire had left its mark on everything. The barn was still standing, though the scorch marks ran like a memory along its sides, telling the story of what had nearly been lost. Jack and Maggie had cleaned up what they could, put out what fire still smoldered, but now, as night settled over the ranch, everything seemed quieter. The air had cooled, but the weight of the day hung heavy, like the earth was still holding its breath. Jack sat on the old porch steps, the wood creaking under his weight, his boots dusty from the day's work. He looked up at the sky, the stars clearer than they had been in years, shining like little pinpricks in the black velvet of night. There was no sound but the soft rustle of the wind, the occasional creak of the porch as Maggie joined him, sitting down just a little further than he wanted her to. The space between them was always just a little too wide, even when they were in the same room. It felt like a distance neither of them knew how to close. She didn't say anything at first. Neither of them did. They sat there in the quiet, the world around them still, except for the occasional chirp of crickets. Jack's hands rested on his knees, his eyes fixed on the stars, though they didn't seem to be speaking to him tonight. They weren't offering answers. They never did. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost drowned out by the night, but it was there, steady as always. "You ever wonder what happens to places like this?" she asked, her eyes staring straight ahead. "What happens when people leave? When will they stop trying?" Jack shifted, glancing at her for the first time in what felt like hours. She wasn't looking at him, but he knew she could feel him staring. "Guess I always figured it would just keep going," he replied, his voice rough from the smoke and the exhaustion that seemed to have settled into his bones. "The land doesn't stop for anyone." Maggie nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the porch, almost as if she were trying to find a connection in the wood, something familiar. "No, it doesn't. It just keeps going." The tension between them was still there, thick and heavy, Like a wall neither of them could scale. They were sitting beside each other, but the space between them felt infinite. Maggie hadn't looked at him yet, and Jack wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever was in her eyes. They both had too many things left unsaid, things they might never say. "I don't know how you did it," Jack muttered after a moment, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear. "How you kept going after everything." Maggie's eyes flicked to him, the faintest flicker of surprise in them before her expression hardened again, but there was something in her gaze now, something different, like she was letting him in for the first time. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "None of us did. Not really." Jack's chest tightened. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the weight of all the years they had lost, all the things left unsaid. He wanted to reach out, but the distance was too much, and the fear of what he might hear, what he might see in her face, kept him rooted to the spot. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You could have left all of it behind, Maggie. You didn't have to stay here in all this mess." She shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving the ground. "And where would I have gone, Jack? What was left for me after Nathan? After everything?" The question lingered in the air, hanging between them like the stars above. Jack didn't have an answer for her. How could he? How could he ever answer for all the things he had left undone, for all the choices he had made to walk away, to leave her behind? Maggie turned her gaze up to the sky, her face soft in the moonlight. For a moment, Jack saw her differently. She wasn't just the woman he had left behind, the one who had carried the weight of everything on her own shoulders. She was more. She had survived. And maybe that was something Jack hadn't truly understood until now. "I guess I never asked you that," Maggie said after a long pause, her voice quiet but steady. "I never asked you why you left." Jack's heart sank, the words feeling like a punch in the chest. He had always known this was coming, but hearing it out loud, hearing the rawness of it, made it feel real. It had been too long. Too many years had passed for him to find an easy answer now. "I couldn't stay," he said, the words coming out in a rush, like they had been waiting for years to escape. I couldn't be what you needed. Not back then." Maggie didn't answer right away. She just sat there, looking at him, her expression unreadable. Jack could feel her eyes on him, could feel the weight of everything he had hidden, everything he had been too afraid to face. "You never told me that," she said finally, her voice softer now. "You never told me why. Not really. Not until now." The silence stretched again, heavy and thick. Jack wasn't sure how to fix it, how to make up for all the things he hadn't said. But Maggie didn't seem angry, not the way he expected her to be. She was just there, present, in a way that was more painful than anything he could have imagined. "I don't know if I'm sorry enough, Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if it'll ever be enough." Her gaze softened then, and for a moment, Jack saw something in her eyes, something more than just the pain, more than the years they had spent apart. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, flickering like a flame that had just been reignited. "I'm not asking you to fix it, Jack," she replied, her voice low and steady. "I'm not asking you to make it right. I'm asking you to stop running." Jack looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time in years. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it was different. It had shifted. He wasn't sure how it would all play out, how they would move forward from here, but for the first time, he felt like maybe they didn't have to fight anymore. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other, if only for a little while. The night stretched on, the stars above them silent witnesses to everything that had been said, and everything that still needed to be said. But for now, the silence between them wasn't so bad. It wasn't the wall it used to be. It was something else, something less heavy, less suffocating. And for the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was so alone anymore. Maggie didn't say anything else. She just sat there, beside him, her presence steady and constant, like the stars above them, like the land that stretched on forever. They didn't need to speak anymore. The unspoken words between them hung in the air, but now there was no rush to say them. Not yet, not tonight, but Jack knew that maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to say them soon. The well had been there for as long as Jack could remember, tucked behind the barn, half hidden by a tangle of wild brush and dry grass. He'd never thought much of it. It was old, forgotten, nothing more than a relic from a time before the ranch had been his, before it had been anything other than a place where memories were buried, along with everything else. Jack had passed it countless times, each time thinking that it was just a hole in the ground, a forgotten piece of the land. He never had any reason to think it held more than that. But Maggie did. She found it in the early morning light, the sun just beginning to creep over the horizon, painting the sky a soft orange. She was out by the barn, walking through the overgrown grass, her boots crunching softly against the earth. She had been quieter lately, not speaking much, but Jack had seen the way her eyes moved, searching, watching, as if she were waiting for something. Jack hadn't seen her go near the well. He hadn't even thought to warn her about it. But there she was, standing over the edge, looking down into the dark hole that had sat there, ignored, for years. He heard her voice before he saw her face. "Jack," she called, her voice carrying a note of confusion, of disbelief. "Come here." He walked toward her, his boots heavy in the dirt, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't know what he expected, but the look on her face when he finally caught up to her stopped him dead in his tracks. "Maggie." His voice was uncertain, his eyes flicking to the well. "Come see this," she said, almost breathless, as if she hadn't believed it herself. He moved to stand beside her, looking down into the well. There was something in the air, a tension, like the ground was shifting beneath them. Jack didn't know why, but something about the sight of the well felt different. Now, it wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. It felt like it was pulling at something deep inside him, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Maggie knelt beside the well, her fingers brushing against the edge. Her face was pale in the morning light, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jack followed her gaze, his heart thumping in his chest as his eyes locked on something that didn't belong there. A piece of metal glinted in the dark water below. He stepped forward, kneeling beside her. The water was murky, the bottom hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking it. The glint of metal, the unmistakable outline of something heavy. He didn't need to look closely to know what it was. "Jack, do you see that?" Maggie's voice was tight, as if she was afraid to say it out loud. "I see it," Jack replied, his voice low, a knot forming in his throat. The glint of metal was unmistakable. A badge. The badge. His father's badge. The one he had thought was lost. The one that had slipped from his father's hand all those years ago, during the fight that had torn the family apart. He hadn't thought about it in years. He hadn't wanted to think about it. But here it was, resting at the bottom of that old well, buried and forgotten, just like everything else. Maggie's hand hovered over the edge, her fingers trembling as she reached for the rope tied nearby, meant to help pull up the water when they needed it. "Maggie," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we don't need to do this." But Maggie didn't hear him. She was already pulling the rope, her arms straining as she hoisted the bucket up from the depths of the well. It creaked, the sound a long, eerie groan that made the air between them feel thicker, colder. She stopped for a moment, her hands gripping the rope so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Jack could see the determination in her eyes, a fire that he hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't backing down. "I have to know," she said softly, her gaze not leaving the bucket. "We have to know what's down there." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his throat, caught somewhere between regret and fear. He had always known there were things buried here, things that the land would never forget. But this was different. This wasn't just about the ranch. This was about something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. The bucket came up slowly, creaking and groaning as it broke the surface. When Maggie finally tipped it over, the water sloshed out, but the badge stayed there, still lodged in the bottom. She reached down, pulling it out carefully, her hands trembling as she turned it over in her fingers. Jack stood up, taking a step back. He didn't want to look at it, didn't want to face it, but Maggie held it out to him anyway, the metal gleaming in the weak sunlight. "Jack," she said, her voice low, "this isn't just your father's badge. There's something else, something buried with it." Jack's heart skipped a beat as his eyes landed on the back of the badge. The engraving was faint, but still legible. A name he had heard once, years ago, whispered in the corners of the house, never spoken aloud. "Jesse Calloway," Maggie read aloud, her voice soft but clear. "Jack's brother." The name hit him like a physical blow. Jesse Calloway, his brother, the brother who had disappeared years ago, leaving only questions, leaving only silence. Jack's throat went dry, the weight of the truth settling over him like a ton of bricks. Maggie didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She was already putting the pieces together. She already knew what this meant. "I thought he was gone," Jack finally whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought he—" "Jack, he's not gone," Maggie interrupted softly. "He was buried here, right here, and your father, he knew. He must have known." Jack's world tilted. Everything he had thought was buried, forgotten, had come to light again. His brother, the one who had disappeared, the one who had vanished without a trace. Jesse wasn't lost. He had been here all along, hidden beneath the earth, hidden in the history of this place. Jack's voice cracked. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't know what to say. Maggie's eyes softened, but there was no pity in them. There was something stronger than that now, something closer to understanding. "The truth is here, Jack," she said, her voice steady. "And now you have to face it. You have to face what your father did, what you've been running from." Jack looked at her then, really looked at her. For the first time, he saw her clearly, not as the woman he had once known, not as the woman he had left behind, but as someone who had fought through her own history, as someone who had survived. For the first time in years, Jack realized she wasn't just beside him. She was ahead of him. The power had shifted, and for the first time, Maggie was the one in control. There was no going back now. The truth had been uncovered, and with it, everything had changed. The air felt heavy that evening, the weight of everything hanging between them like the dust that lingered in the corners of the old house. Jack stood by the door, looking out at the land that had been his for as long as he could remember. The fields stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, just like the years he had spent running from everything he should have faced. His fingers tightened around the doorframe as he stared into the distance, his mind churning with everything that had happened. The truth, the badge, Jesse's name. Everything was too much, too fast, and it was suffocating him. Maggie was inside, her presence like a constant pull, the gravity of it dragging at him, even from across the room. He knew she was waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to do something, but he couldn't move, couldn't find the words. He had always thought he had time to fix things, time to make amends, time to walk away if it got too hard. But time had run out, and he was still standing here, trying to figure out what kind of man he could be now. The man who had walked away all those years ago was a stranger to him. That man, the one who had left Maggie behind, was nothing like the person he was trying to become. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. "Jack," Maggie's voice came softly from behind him, and he flinched, though he didn't turn around. "I need to hear it from you. I need you to make me a promise." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. A promise. A promise he had sworn he would never make. A promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I can't promise you that," Jack said, his voice rough, his throat tight. "I can't promise things will get better. Not like you want me to." "I'm not asking for some grand gesture, Jack," Maggie said, and he could hear the weariness in her voice. "I'm asking for something simple, something real." Jack closed his eyes, his hand still gripping the doorframe. The ghosts of his past, of the decisions he had made, were coming back to haunt him. They weren't just in his head. They were in the land, in the house, in the silence between him and Maggie. And the worst part was, he couldn't outrun them anymore. He couldn't hide from what he had done. "You want me to stay," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to make up for everything. But I don't know if I can." "I don't need you to fix everything," Maggie replied, her voice steady, but there was something in the way she said it that made him turn around. "I need you to stop running, Jack. I need you to be here, now." He met her eyes, and the weight of everything between them came crashing down on him. She wasn't asking for much. She wasn't asking for some perfect redemption. She wasn't asking for him to be the man he thought he was supposed to be. She was asking him to be present, to be the man he could still become, not the one he had left behind. The realization hit him hard, and it felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. All these years, he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing by leaving, by running, by pushing everything away. But it wasn't right. Not for him, not for Maggie, and definitely not for the man he wanted to be. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't take back the things he had done. But maybe, just maybe, he could change the future. I promised myself I wouldn't make any promises, Jack said, his voice rough. But there was something stronger in it now, something that hadn't been there before. But I can't keep running from you. From this. Maggie's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, waiting for him to keep going, to say the words she had been waiting to hear. I'll stay, Jack said finally, the words coming out more easily than he expected. I'll stay, and I'll try. I'll try to be the man you need me to be. But I don't know if I can be who I was before. I don't know if I can ever fix everything. He paused, his eyes locked on hers. The weight of the promise hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. He wasn't sure he could keep it. He wasn't sure he could fix all the things he had broken, but he could try. For the first time, he realized that trying might be enough. I don't need you to fix everything, Maggie said softly, her gaze never leaving him. I just need you to try. Jack nodded slowly, his throat tightening. It wasn't much. It wasn't the promise he had once made to himself, the promise to always be in control, always to keep running when things got too hard. But it was something. It was a step forward, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right step. He took a deep breath and turned back toward the door, his hand resting on the frame. I'll try, Maggie, he said, his voice stronger now. I'll try to be here. For you. For me. Maggie didn't move. She stood there, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him as if she was still waiting for something more. But Jack didn't know if there was more to give. He didn't know if he could be everything she needed him to be. But he would try. The silence stretched between them again, but it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. The weight of the promise was still there, but it wasn't crushing anymore. It was a weight he could carry, a weight they could carry together. Jack didn't know if he could keep the promise. He didn't know if he was the man he thought he should be, but for the first time he felt like he was becoming the man he needed to be, and that was something worth fighting for. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly, his voice steady. Not this time. Maggie's gaze softened, and for the first time, Jack saw something like hope in her eyes. It wasn't a perfect hope. It wasn't a hope that promised everything would be easy or that everything would be fixed, but it was a hope that was real, a hope that said maybe, just maybe, they could still make it work. And that, for now, was enough. The wind howled across the ranch, carrying the scent of smoke, dust, and something else, something that felt like the beginning of a storm. The sun was setting, its fading light casting long shadows across the land, but there was no peace in the quiet anymore. Jack could feel it in the air, the tension, the rising threat. The ranch had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Maggie stood at his side, her face set in that same unyielding expression he had seen before, the one that told him she was ready for whatever came next. She was already moving, already making preparations, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't hesitate to follow her lead. He'd fought battles before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about fire or the land or even the ranch. This was about survival, about keeping what was theirs, about keeping each other safe. They weren't alone anymore. Do you hear that? Maggie's voice broke through the wind, quiet but insistent. Jack paused, his eyes scanning the horizon. At first, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of land, the brush, the worn fences. But then, he heard it, a sound in the distance. The faint rumble of engines, cars, vehicles moving fast, kicking up dust behind them. Who the hell is that? Jack muttered under his breath. Maggie didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and grabbed a shovel from the pile of tools they had set out earlier in the day. The air had already shifted, the tension growing with every passing second, and Jack knew it wasn't just an innocent convoy passing through. There was something purposeful about the way they were moving. They're not just passing by, Maggie said, her voice low. They're coming for us. Jack didn't need any more explanation. He turned, moving quickly toward the barn where they kept the rifles. They had known something like this might come. The ranch had always been a target for the powerful men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. But this was different. This wasn't just about land. This was about them, about their place in this world. He looked at Maggie, who was already halfway to the fence, her hand gripping the shovel tightly, ready for whatever was about to happen. The fear Jack had been trying to ignore clawed at his chest, but he shoved it aside. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. You think they'll get through? He asked, his voice tight, his breath coming faster. Maggie didn't look at him as she lifted the shovel, her gaze locked on the road ahead. They'll try, but they'll regret it. Jack could feel the heat between them, not from the sun, but from something more, something they hadn't talked about, something that had been building between them for days, for weeks, maybe even years. They had always been two separate forces, Jack, with his fear and his guilt, and Maggie with her strength and resilience. But now, at this moment, they were fighting together for the same thing, for the same future. The sound of the engines grew louder, and Jack's pulse quickened. The time for talking was over. "We need to hold them off," Jack said, his voice sharp, taking control for the first time. Maggie nodded, her eyes meeting him for the first time in what felt like forever. She didn't need to say anything. The unspoken understanding passed between them, thick and undeniable. They were in this. Together, whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Jack moved quickly, grabbing the rifle and checking it, the familiar weight of it grounding him, focusing him. The land around them might be changing, but he could still control this. He could still fight for what was his, for what was theirs. Maggie was already by the gate, her stance steady, her eyes locked on the approaching convoy. Jack joined her, standing beside her, ready for whatever came next. The vehicles appeared on the horizon, dark shapes against the fading light. There were at least 3 trucks, maybe more, kicking up dust as they barreled toward the ranch. Jack could see the men in the back of the trucks, their faces hard and determined, their movements swift and practiced. "They're coming for us," Jack repeated, more to himself than to Maggie. She didn't look away. "Then we'll make sure they don't get what they want." The first truck pulled up to the gate, its engine roaring as it skidded to a halt. The men in the back jumped down, weapons in hand, their faces twisted with the kind of hunger Jack had seen too many times before. They were here to take what they thought was theirs. But Jack wasn't going to let them. Without a word, Jack raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The men froze for a moment, but they didn't back down. Maggie didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her shovel raised high, and swung it with all her strength, striking one of the men across the chest. The force of it sent him staggering back, but he didn't fall. Another man raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, Maggie was already on him, knocking the weapon out of his hands with a swift, practiced motion. Jack was right beside her, firing again, taking out another man before he could make a move. The chaos erupted around them, the dust rising in the air, the sounds of gunfire, shouting, the clash of metal on metal. But through it all, Jack and Maggie moved together, their actions synchronized, each knowing exactly where the other would be, what the other would do. In that moment, it wasn't just about surviving the attack. It was about something deeper. They weren't just fighting for the ranch. They were fighting for each other, for the bond they hadn't been able to face until now. The men were retreating, some of them wounded, some of them scrambling back to the trucks in confusion. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, his hands shaking from the adrenaline, but he didn't lower his rifle. Not yet. Maggie stood beside him, breathing hard, her eyes scanning the area, making sure the threat had passed. The air was thick with the aftermath, with the weight of everything that had just happened. Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her differently. It wasn't just the woman who had survived everything on her own. It was the woman who had stood by him, the woman who had fought for the same future, the same land. She wasn't just his past anymore. She was his present. They didn't need to say anything. The unspoken connection between them was enough. The battle wasn't over. They both knew that. But the shift had already happened. Maggie wasn't just standing beside him. She was standing with him in a way that neither of them had expected. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. For the first time, Jack felt the weight of his promise, unbroken, yet heavier than before. The flames of their unresolved history had burned bright, but now they were something different, something forged in fire, and there was no going back. The sun was low in the sky when Jack saw the dust rise again, this time from the opposite end of the ranch. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a truck, a familiar truck, the same one that had been parked on the outskirts of town for years, a reminder of everything Jack had tried to forget. Gus. Jack felt his chest tighten. He had been expecting this. He hadn't wanted to believe it, but he'd known it was only a matter of time before Gus would come back, dragging the past with him like a storm cloud. The last time they had spoken, Gus had left with no promise of return, but now the rumble of the truck's engine broke through the silence, bringing with it a wave of dread. Maggie stood beside Jack as they watched the vehicle approach. The ground trembled with each bump of the tires, and Jack could feel his pulse quicken. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He knew she could feel it too. The shift in the air, the way the weight of the past had suddenly fallen upon them once again. The truck stopped just short of the house. Gus climbed out, his boots thudding loudly against the earth as he made his way toward them, his expression as hard as ever. Jack didn't move. He didn't have to. He knew what was coming. "You're back," Jack said, his voice flat, though it didn't hide the bitterness underneath. Gus didn't greet him. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ranch, taking in the land, the house, everything Jack had tried to rebuild. "This place is still standing," Gus muttered, as if that was some kind of victory. "Didn't expect it to be. Didn't expect you to still be here." Jack didn't respond. He didn't have to. The years of silence between them hung thick in the air, like an invisible barrier neither of them knew how to cross. "You always were good at running, Jack," Gus said, his tone mocking, like it was the only thing he could say. "Thought you'd run again. Guess I was wrong." Maggie stepped forward then, her gaze sharp as she locked eyes with Gus. Jack didn't say anything. He just watched her, wondering what she was thinking, how she was going to handle this, because he knew that the weight of the past wasn't just on his shoulders anymore. It was on hers too. "Gus," Maggie said, her voice firm but calm. "What do you want?" Gus's eyes flicked to her, his lips curling into a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What do I want?" he repeated. "I want what's mine." Jack's stomach sank. He knew what Gus was talking about. The land, the ranch, everything Jack had fought so hard to protect. But Maggie didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her stance steady, her gaze unwavering. "You don't get to take it, Gus," she said. "Not anymore." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken challenges. Jack could feel the tension building between them. Gus had always been the one to wield power with a heavy hand, but Maggie wasn't backing down. She was standing her ground, and for the first time, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. You're not in charge here, Maggie," Gus said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're just a guest. Jack's always been the one running things. You think you can change that?" Maggie's eyes never wavered. "This is my land too," she said, her voice clear and firm, "and I'll fight for it just as hard as Jack ever did." Jack watched them, feeling the weight of their words settle in his chest. Gus had come back with a purpose, with the same threats that had torn them all apart in the first place. But Maggie wasn't afraid. She wasn't shaking, wasn't backing away from the fight. Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for her. She had always been the one to hold things together when they threatened to fall apart. And now, when everything was on the line again, she was the one leading the charge. "You can't win this fight, Gus," she said. "We've been through too much to let you take it all away. Not again." Gus sneered, but it didn't have the same power it once did. There was something different in Maggie's voice, something that made him hesitate, even if only for a moment. "You don't understand," Gus said, his voice quieter now. "This ranch was never yours to keep, Jack. You've made your mistakes, and now it's time to pay for them." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. The weight of the years between them threatened to suffocate him. He had always known this day would come. The day when the past would come crashing back, but he hadn't expected it to feel this heavy. He hadn't expected to feel so small in front of Maggie, so unsure of everything. "I'm done running, Gus," Jack finally said, his voice firm, though it wavered under the weight of everything. "This is mine, and I'll fight for it." Maggie turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, Jack felt like they were the only two people in the world. The past was crashing down around them, but they had each other. That had to be enough. "Let's end this," Maggie said, turning back to Gus. "Once and for all." Gus hesitated, his eyes flicking between them, but there was no going back now. The past had already collided with the present. Their fates were sealed. There was no running this time. "We'll see who walks away with the land," Gus said, his voice cold and final. And with that, he turned and walked back to his truck, his shadow long against the fading light. Jack stood there, watching him go, but his thoughts were focused on Maggie. She had taken control. She had led them through the storm, and now they would face whatever came next together. There was no turning back. The battle was just beginning, and Jack knew that with Maggie by his side, they would fight. Together. The storm was coming, but for the first time, Jack didn't feel like he was alone in it. The final confrontation came faster than they expected, the sharp edge of it cutting through the quiet of the ranch like a knife. Gus had returned with a vengeance, and this time he wasn't backing down. Jack and Maggie stood together side by side at the edge of the land they'd fought so hard to protect. The wind whipped around them as if the earth itself was holding its breath. It was now or never. Gus stood across from them, his stance aggressive, his eyes hard as stone. The years of tension between them had built to this moment, and Jack could feel the weight of every decision that had brought them here, every mistake, every lie. But there was no time for regret now, only action. "You think you can just walk away from all this?" Gus sneered, his voice like poison. "You've always been weak, Jack, always running, always hiding from what you really are." Jack's fists clenched at his sides, the anger rising in his chest. But before he could respond, Maggie stepped forward, her eyes cold and resolute. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. "You don't get to talk about what we've built," Maggie said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "This land, this life, it's ours, and you're not taking it from us." Gus's lips twisted into a bitter smile, his eyes flicking between Jack and Maggie. "I don't need to take anything," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've already given it away. You're nothing without me." Maggie's gaze never wavered. She was the first to break the silence, the first to call out the truth they had all been avoiding for so long. "You've always thought you were in control, Gus. But you're not. You never were." The words hit like a slap, and for the first time, Jack saw the flicker of doubt in Gus's eyes. The facade cracked, but it was too late. There was nothing left to lose now. The power dynamics had shifted. Maggie had taken control. She wasn't afraid anymore. Jack stepped closer to her, his voice low but firm. "We're done running, Gus. This is the end." Gus's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists. He lunged forward, but before Jack could react, Maggie stepped in front of him, her body blocking Gus's path. "If you want to fight," she said, her voice unwavering, "you'll have to go through me first." Gus hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but there was something in Maggie's gaze that made him stop. For a moment, Jack saw the man Gus once was, the man who had been in control of everything, the man who had ruled with fear. But now, in the face of Maggie's strength, he was nothing more than a shadow of his former self. Without a word, Gus backed down, his shoulders sagging as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the distance. The battle was over. Jack stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his mind spinning. Maggie turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something. But there was no need for words now. They had fought the fight, and they had won. The dust began to settle around them, the wind dying down as the night took over. It was over. The past no longer had a hold on them. Jack and Maggie stood in the silence of their victory, the weight of everything they had faced finally lifting. Maggie reached out, her hand finding his, and for the first time in years, Jack felt like he could breathe again. The emotional transformation was complete. They had faced the ghosts of their past, and they had come out the other side. But as they stood there, the future still uncertain, Jack knew one thing for sure. They weren't the same people they had been before. The past no longer defined them, and with Maggie by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, together. The night stretched out before them, and with it, a new beginning.